I see nobody sitting in the poet's chair. It's really hard to get anyone to sit in the poet's chair. It's almost like it's haunted or something, yeah. But I mean, maybe it is, maybe maybe poets of the past, maybe the collective spirits of the poets of the past are sitting in that chair. Who knows? Welcome to the Poetry Room, everybody. I'm Peter Maravellis, and for those of you online, welcome to you too. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. And I do want to take a moment to say that it is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so, and also to be able to broadcast from this really wonderful, very important space, which even those of us who work here, it never gets lost on us when you just kind of look around and look at these shelves. So it's a real pleasure. So always a delight to have Miranda Mellis with us, and also even more so celebrating the launch of her new book, Crocosmia. Which is published by the very distinguished Nightboat Books. We love Nightboat. You'll notice a lot of Nightboat titles on these shelves. So Crocosmia is a novel that at once celebrates the liberation of consciousness while addressing the responsibility of the artist to imagine a positive and generative future, while also having the courage to suggest that we may actually be on the verge of that future now. So Crocosmia explores the relationship between the collective and the individual, offering us possibilities for reimagining and realizing lives lived with creativity, empathy, and humanity. So Miranda Mellis is the author of numerous books. These include Demystifications, which was published in 2021, the book The Instead, published in 2016, The Spokes, which was published in 2012, None of This is Real, which was published in 2012, and also The Revisionist, published in 2007. She's been an artist in resident at the Headland Center for the Arts, just across the bay, also the Vermont Studio Center, as well as the Millay Colony. She received a John Hawkes Prize in Fiction and also the Michael S. Harper Praxis Prize for her work. She grew up here in San Francisco, but now lives in Olympia, Washington. Joining her tonight is none other than Eleni Stecopoulos. We've always had a great pleasure of having Eleni with us as well. She is no stranger to City Lights. She is a poet, essayist, and critic. Her most recent book is Dreaming in the Fault Zone, A Poetics of Healing, which is also published by the lovely Nightboat. Eleni's appearance is especially auspicious because Miranda was actually the conversationist for the launch of Eleni's book, Dreaming in the Fault Zone, which we featured in our reading series last year. So City Lights is actually going to be also hosting a workshop with Eleni and Rebecca Rutkoff just down the street over at the Knesset Gallery. That's going to be in November. So I encourage you all, please do check out the City Lights calendar for that. You will need to register. It's kind of an afternoon-long event. For those of you online, tonight we will be posting links with which you may purchase books. For those of you here, we will be making time for a signing. We're also going to have a Q&A towards the end. So for those of you online, do post your questions and comments in that chat as well. So please join us in giving a warm welcome to Miranda Mellis and Eleni Stecopoulos. Welcome to City Lights.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you, Eleni, for having this conversation. I think Eleni and I should just come to City Lights once a year, every fall, and do something. Thank you all for being here. It's just so many people I love in this room, and I'm really grateful that you're here. So I'm just going to read a bit from Crocosmia, and then Eleni and I will have a conversation. I guess I need to hold this thing. Can you hear me? I probably do need to. Should I use it?
We can, I think the online audience.
Yeah, okay. Let's do it. Just to, like I need another hand. So I did want to say one thing before I start, which is that one of the things that we kind of take in at some point in our lives as writers and artists is that we should not be didactic, right? Is that true? Do you think that's true? Yeah, sort of. Yeah. And I just, you know what, there's different things that we can say about this book, and I mostly am looking forward to talking with Eleni about it with you. But I was thinking earlier today about this, like, question I had about I really wanted to be didactic. But I was like, how do I be didactic without being didactic? And so what's the equation? And it's like didacticism plus pain equals Crocosmia. Or didacticism plus, emotional honesty or something like this. Or emotional honesty and anti-capitalism. So, and I want to also say that this book is a prayer. It's a spell. It's a prayer to unleash our brilliance and playfulness and knowledge with dedication and faith to bring about the great turning that Joanna Macy conceptualized and from which this book draws much of its inspiration. Okay, so I'm going to read from chapter 4. It seemed to her a decision had been made a long time ago, and now Jane would simply embody it. She would bring Maya to Enid, show the films, and then she would go underground. Underground was a way to die without dying, to die before they killed you, an exile that kept you free. She would go to ground like a fox or a rabbit. They had been living for 6 years in the bungalow in the forest when Jane told Maya, who was now 20, they were going on a trip to the anarchistery to show Jane's film, 7 Days of Decreation. They drove for the first few hours quietly, listening to music and news. You know, Maya, there are always things unfolding that we have no say in, Jane began. Most things, almost everything. We are little aspects, tiny facets of an unendingness, which includes its own invisible life forms who are always with us. Maya didn't reply. Jane glanced at her. She was asleep. They passed a group of cows lying down in the shade of an oak tree. Jane pulled over, slowed to a stop. She searched for the right words. There has been an exclusivism on the matter of salvation which contradicts the teaching of unconditional love, that all spiritual traditions are rays of universal light. It's so important to understand that this universal light is not a metaphor. It's the sun itself. Jane stepped out of the car, looked up at the sky, and lifted up her arms full of love for the sky. We are planetary beings, so we are never alone, she went on. The sun has given us everything. The earth has given us everything. How do we reciprocate? Maya opened her eyes with an ache in her neck, instantly forgetting her dream. To her left was her mother outside the car, folding her arms up to the sky, presumably stretching. They would screen Jane's film in the dining hall. Enid helped Jane set up the practice screening. As it turned out, that was the only time it was ever shown. Enid and Maya, the only audience. Enid made the following notes about that afternoon. Jane wanted to do a practice screening of her film and needed help with the setup and projectors. Maya, Jane, and I went to the dining hall where there was going to be a public screening of her animations the following week, which of course never happened, and helped Jane set up. We arranged a row of 7 small tables. On each table was a film projector aimed at the wall, and on the table behind each camera, a thick dossier, documents of the crimes committed by the 7 heads of state she had taken as her subjects. Jane showed us how to run the projectors. Each projector had to be started 7 seconds apart. She started the first one and moved to the 4th one. I started the 2nd one and moved to the 5th one. Maya started the 3rd one and moved to the 6th one, by which time Jane had moved to the 7th projector. The animations showed one after another 7 recognizable heads of state. My eyes moved from left to right to see a pattern. Each individual film was its own animation, but all together they also made one animation, a kind of flip book. In each film, one after another, in a cascade, the heads of state came flickering into view. A red woman appeared in the first film, emerging from the bottom left-hand side of the frame. A sun appeared above her, casting a subtle, billowing net of light. following the red woman as she glided behind the first head of state. When the sun first appeared on the screen, a handwritten text briefly flickered across it, world leader. The red woman plucked the head of state from his body and dropped it. It rolled slowly down. Intricately, realistically, and microscopically rendered soil appeared at the bottom of the screen, just as the head fell into it, planted. The red woman dropped out of the lower right hand of that screen and reappeared on the next one to pluck and drop that head, and so on through all the films, the sun following along, obligingly shedding light. A slow downward line was drawn across the neck, a continuous seam between the shoulders as along a bent elbow or thigh, so that rather than a cutting, severing, or wounding, the head simply disappeared down into the neck in a gentle wave. Where the head had been, a sloping, empty, bowl-shaped line appeared. The headless bodies then changed their substances as the animated woman and sun rose and set behind them, harvesting and planting. The figures, first besuited, then beheaded, began to change form. In the first animation, the head of a genocidal apartheid state, a mass murderer who refused to step down, though the people en masse demanded, fought, and died for it, became mud and cyanobacteria, and we heard creaks and suction. In the second, an imperialist expansionist head of state, a lying, thieving, self-and crony-enriching patriarchal opportunist, turned into incandescent light and emanated the sound of 1,000 frogs croaking at one helicopter. In the third, an arms-dealing dictator who let the people starve and sold their farmland to mining corporations became moss and jellyfish. We heard rain, vortexes, and billowing. The fourth tyrant who neglected and tortured the people and held writers and artists in prisons for decades became fire, steam, and smoke, and we heard cracking glass and whips, engines, and earth movers. The fifth, who fomented abuse and murder of people whose religions differed from his, turned to copper, bronze, and iron as the sound of ringing bells, cooking, and the roar of chainsaws and bulldozers filled the air. The sixth of the sociopathic exploiters in chief, poverty-creating and war-addicted, who used the people's resources to make missiles and let them starve, was transmuted into papyrus, plastic, and code, to the scratching sound of writing, the groan and churn of appliances, the whir of drones, and the click, click, click of vibrating computers. The seventh head of state, a double-talking, finger-wagging, ideology-dulled, market-worshipping Pollyanna, complicitly enabling mass murder, a secretary of ruination and death, dissolved in silence. Then the red woman, the sun, and the bodies were gone. To the sound of myriad singing birds, whales, and coyotes, all at once, complex red flowers appeared on each screen. Finally, blank film leader, which Jane had washed in the ocean, ran through the projector, and all we saw and heard was the sea. The correlated vanishing of the real heads of the world leaders who had been depicted in Jane's films and the sudden bloom of the second set of Seven Wonders was something Enid did not even try to make sense of. She felt that the boundaries between dreaming, waking, sleeping, praying, and meditating had disappeared completely, and Jane also disappeared along with these demarcations, as if pulling out the threads and pins as she went. They looked through Jane's things to try to ascertain where she might have gone. It seemed she had taken little to nothing with her. They found 2 notebooks in Jane's desk about the film project. That her actions would be unattributable and invisible were, she wrote, not only the condition of possibility for, but more importantly, the underlying principle of her strike. Under certain circumstances, Jane's notes relayed, light striking an object could excite electrons to generate electromagnetic waves perfectly out of phase, rendering the object invisible. You could make objects disappear by bending light around them. On astronomical scales, the gravitation of black holes warps space to alter the path of light, and it was possible to bend light with metamaterials, which could make objects invisible by guiding light around them, like water flowing around a rock so that the rock cannot be seen. Jane had transcribed a passage from the Fulminologist, Martin A. Uman, on a piece of notepaper and taped to the wall above her editing table, on which her camera, her splicer, her projector, and her notebook sat. What is important is that the usual stepped leader starts from the cloud without any knowledge of what buildings or geography are present below. In fact, it is thought that the stepped leader is unaware of objects beneath it until it is some 10 of yards from the eventual strike point. When awareness occurs, a traveling spark is initiated from the point to be struck and propagates upward to meet the downward moving stepped leader, completing the path to ground. Jane had written in red ink beneath that quote, "The method of the unattributable strike is non-locality." Enid gathered that the non-existence of any sender or receiver before that striking exchange, that uncertain liminal and indeterminate state of seeking each other out that can become a strike or a revolutionary situation, as it was once called, was central to the enactment of what Jane coined telekineticature, a neologism that combines telekinesis and sculpture and holds the dark lightness of film within it as a projective force of vibrating activation of light, redolent of consciousness itself. Jane had come to think of lightning as, in some sense, imaginative. Enid read on. It speculates as it wanders, initiates its stepped leader, wondering, where shall I strike? Sparks from the ground rise to meet it to direct the questing lightning. The surface, quickened by its presence, engenders the lightning that is engendered by it. The non-knowing of the speculative lightning and the blank film leader that is fed into a projector exist in virtuality as potential before what will have been. A film begins, lightning strikes, they choose their moment is now. It doesn't concentrate in order to strike from a distance as we do with telekinesis, moving things with our will. It doesn't strike according to its own will, but rather as a form of meeting, a form of greeting, an occasion, a gathering of disparate forces. The strike is something that happens between the ground and the sky. As a student, Jane studied an intrapsychic universe as logos, interanimating with subjectivity, agency, causality, and justice. Tacked on the wall next to the Uman passage on stepped leader was a quotation from one of Jane's teachers, Dr. Karen Barad, responding to Uman. Injustices need not wait some future remedy because now is already thick with possibilities disruptive of mere presence. Each moment is thickly threaded through all other moments, each a holographic condensation of specific diffraction patterns created by a plethora of virtual wanderings, alternative histories of what is, might yet be, have been. Remembering, then, is not merely subjective, a fleeting flash of a past event in the inner workings of an individual human brain. Rather, it is a constitutive part of the field of space-time mattering. Mayakovsky had recommended a change of plane, to stand back, walk the eroding, diminishing distance to the edge of the cliff, the edge of the page, the edge of time, was the way to define the true condition of things. This was the quasi-scientific attitude recommended to would-be poets and revolutionaries by Mayakovsky, a Bolshevik who killed himself in 1930 instead of killing Stalin, which would have been preferable. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Miranda. That was wonderful. You read from one of my favorite parts of Crocosmia, which is the psychokinetic animations. And as I told you earlier, I just want to say, like, may it be so. And yeah. And I think what's so interesting, one of the many interesting things about that passage and that scene is that there's a proliferation of ways to interpret it. On the one hand, there's this image of a radical break, a cessation that might open the way. It's an image of political violence, and then it seems to, it manifests, right, in actual beheadings that then lead to the appearance of these giant Crocosmia flowers, the second seven wonders. And Jane disappears and goes underground. So there's a proliferation of ways to interpret it as the spark for revolution, possibly as vengeance.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think, so I mean, you were talking earlier about like, oh, don't be didactic, but also how often do we talk about taking revenge, like and as writers, right? I think people often underestimate that aspect. But, so Jane's is a work of art. It's a film. It's a text, but it's also a ritual, right? It's a ritual action. Enid and Maya are part of it. It's only shown once. And it has this quality of being mythological, right? That this regenerative violence, this killing to reseed life. And I wondered if you might talk about the animations, right, that lead to these decapitations of heads of state and thus seem to be the catalyst for the Great Turning. Earlier, you talked about not wanting to be didactic, and I was thinking, but it's interesting because you've also, well, you said it's didacticism plus pain. And one of the ways you've described Crocosmia is as a parable. So I thought you might speak a little bit about the different ways to look at the animations and how it might relate to cosmogony, right? We reference in the book, you reference certain myths, for instance, like the Quiche Maya sacred book, the Popol Vuh. But this is not a creation story, right? It's the 7 days of decreation. So I thought you might jump in there, to talk about this really fascinating crux of the book that Maya, the daughter, sees as the catalyst for what transpires in this great, and the Great Turning and the disappearance of her mother.
Thank you, Eleni. Yeah. Well, what comes to mind first is this kind of notion that came up as I was working on this of thinking of decay as a muse, as one of the missing muses or something, the missing muse, and to think what would be a way of thinking about decay, to use it to think both about ecology and politics, and how ecosystems are prevented from thriving because of the refusal of decay in politics, or the refusal of the willingness to kind of let your power die, like to go away and to decay, and I was sort of trying to think about, so I was trying to think about that on multiple levels, both kind of objects and ecosystems that don't biodegrade, and the kind of resemblance or metonymic relation between, say, like, I think there's an image of, like, there's a suitcase in a river or something, or there's, like a washing machine in a forest or something like this, or, I've seen it in the forest I walk in, and I've seen it like just a couch, or just, these things that are, and sort of this sense of kind of that thing that's there that, that is kind of torquing everything around it, because it won't break down, and thinking about what it could mean to, I guess, you brought up in a correspondence, Eleni mentioned something I hadn't considered, which was that this story is like a reversal of the Demeter and Persephone story, where instead of Persephone going underground in this story, Demeter goes underground, and Persephone, the daughter Maya, is left overground, waiting. So there's kind of all this kind of business of, I guess, metonymic progression and valences and resonances of the ground, going to ground, and then this image of lightning. And maybe to say just one more thing about, the use of this kind of science fiction element of it, where there's some real science in there, but then it gets turned into a device or a mechanism by which the animations can have real effects. So there's the sense of kind of the question of like, there's an artwork within the art, or there's a fiction within the fiction that is saying something about what maybe some ambitions we might have for art and fiction, that they might have that they do have real effects, of course. And yeah. And I wanted to just mention, you brought up Michael Taussig in the correspondence, the anthropologist Michael Taussig, and I learned from him this kind of very unwieldy term, fictocriticism. Fictocriticism, it just sounds so, it's not great.
Popular in Australia is my
Fictocriticism, it's like there's something about it, but it's in his book, The Magic of the State, is one of these works that is working with ethnography, fact, journalism, and fiction. And to kind of, but what's I think important, you made me think about this, about him in particular, is that he's always thinking about sorcery and magic.
and ensorcelment.
And ensorcelment. And the ensorcelment of the state, and the way that the state magically, does its magic, and also the ways that people do their magic, and the way that fiction does its magic. And yeah, I don't know how I got there from here.
Well, and that connects to mystifications, right? And Walter Benjamin is a, presence in the book, and don't have the passage exactly, but there's a moment where you say, well, we're subject to so many fictions, right? Money, capitalism, and why not make not make our own, right? And why dream a bad dream? But there was so much in there that I wanted to address. I'll see if I can remember it. But yes, you brought up science fiction, and I could have added, to the ways of seeing the psychokinetic animations. You coin this telekineticature, which I love. And I think that telekineticature might be one of literature's sort of secret or occult powers. I mean, the Popol Vuh was certainly a book that was cosmopoetic, right? And you enacted, and it was originally performed. And you mentioned the ground, and you've talked about that also as composting tyranny, which you want to think, well, is there some use for them? Is there can they be recycled? You didn't read this passage, but Enid is a psychoanalyst, right? And she works with some of the surviving heads of state, and it's really hilarious, as well as completely depressing when we think about the warmongers and the heads of corporation and the billionaires that were subjected to, and the myriad big lies. But so there is a sense of like, it's very humorous, like trying to help them work through, right, the ones that remain. But maybe we could talk more about that aspect, right? That there are many ways to look at this, this crux, this sort of radical break, this mythological disruption. And we can talk about art and praxis, and and art as prefigurative and in a political sense, right? But there's also an element of the ludic to it. It's very playful. I found myself kind of cackling through the different tyrants going down, and what is emitted from them. And I think I wrote to you, like, is the seventh one Obama? Like the Pollyanna, double talking Pollyanna. And so there's a tricksterism to it, which is classical in the sense of, right, mythologies and creation and decreation. And I wondered if you might talk about, the ludic and also satire Mayakovsky is a big presence in the book. Yeah, I wondered if you might talk about that aspect because there's a lot of there's the ludic and satire, and there's also a lot of humor in the book as well.
Glad to hear you say it. I thought it was funny too. You never know. Yeah, I think in writing fiction for me in the past has always been a place to work with the absurd, right? Or work with absurdity and use absurdism. I mean, maybe it's like another answer to the question of didacticism. It's like you want revenge, you're mad about things, you want things to change, but you don't want to be didactic. So you use surrealism, you use absurdism, you use tragedy, you use all these forms. And particularly with that character, Enid, the psychoanalysis part, I mean, I'm tempted just to maybe read a bit of it. If I can find.
Another favorite part.
Or maybe what I can do is introduce the anarchistry as maybe an aspect of kind of play the ludic and kind of trying to play with like a serious proposition that draws from actual forms of communal life that work very, very well, right? Like whether it's spiritual communities or, where work is distributed fairly and everything gets done. And it's kind of very, I mean, of course, we've all know examples of it not working well, but there are many examples of it working very well. And then the playfulness of this is that so the nuns at the anarchistry call themselves the nuns or the no ones or the nines. So there's wordplay, I guess, is important, here. The nuns, so they're not so attached to, so then the category of nun becomes linguistic, right? And just becomes something that we can open up to its poetics. And then out of that can come all these forms of life, The nuns prayed and meditated individually and together in a rhythm that seemed intuitive and changeable. They practiced collaborative, lucid dreaming to solve problems and make decisions. They reversed the usual formula of dream interpretation, in which the dream was first remembered and then explicated. They made interpretations first and then had dreams out of their interpretations. It was after one of their collaborative dreams that they called Jane in from the grounds where she was planting trees and asked her to meet with them. They had made an interpretation about Jane and then set out to have a dream about her. In it, she had been swimming with a group of sharks, carrying a candle underwater that somehow stayed lit. The sharks had allowed her to follow them. Holding her candle, Jane watched them hunt, shed thousands of teeth, and swim sleep on the ocean floor. The candle flame turned into a leaf, the candle into a branch. As the sharks slept, rocking their bodies gently side to side, their bodies turned to great green leaves, breathing and swaying, catching the light. Their teeth were leaves. The ocean became a forest. Enid offered the interpretation they wrote out before the dream, one form becoming another. She handwrote their interpretation for Jane on a piece of blue notepaper, which Jane folded up and kept in her wallet for the rest of her life. Trappists made ale. The nuns grew milk thistle to be planted where plutonium was being detoxified. And so on and so on. So what they're up to, they're doing remediation projects and writing interpretations and then dreaming together, which people do. People have been known to do this, to like lucid dream together and talk to each other and solve problems in dreams and things. Anybody want to try with me? Let's do it. I'll meet you in dream time.
I think maybe dreaming brings up the question of imagination, right? So you've invoked this, and many have said, about climate change. right? I mean, Ghosh, for instance, writes of the great derangement, and there's a sense of a failure of imagination. And of course, we're living in times of so-called dark times, which is one of my pet peeves. But a time of a lot of pessimism, right? A time of mass death, genocide, and I wonder, and this is something I wrote to you, the sense that I had reading Crocosmia was that the problem is not a failure of imagination, but that Crocosmia is showing us a way that is sort of like rebodying or making corporeal again or material the link between imagination and will. Right. So you have a dream, you have a text, you have a film. What's the relationship of that to action, to material change, to these toxic, tyrants being gone? And right. And all of a sudden there's this field, there's this clearing for the people who do the work of repair and remediation and redistribution of work and abolition of wealth, as you put it in the book, right? For all of this stuff now to have a chance, right? So I wondered if you might talk to your sense of that and in how you were even able to write this book that envisions the world that so many of us want that seems just impossible. I thought it might be interesting to hear you talk about that, if you would.
Part of the crisis is metaphysical. Do you agree?
Yeah. But of course, not only.
Not only. We know that it's material and we know that it's, and if there's a metaphysical crisis as well, then what would constitute what some people are calling metaphysical activism? It's one of the places for culture workers, for people who work imaginatively, for artists to make a contribution, I think, is one thing. I can also just say that I was motivated by a great sense of exhaustion with the constant proliferation of dystopias, and a memory of Frederick Jameson, who said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that word imagine, right? So how do we make it easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world? And he called for the writing of utopias, ambiguous utopias, ambivalent utopias. So it seems almost like an assignment to receive, to whose work is it to imagine, to help us imagine things, right? And if people we need to represent suffering and we need the dystopias and all of this, but we also do need to, David Graeber has this idea of baseline communism. Do you know that, Ben? You're nodding your head. Like, it just is, how would you describe it?
It's happening underneath things already anyway.
It's happening all the time because there's all these things that we do where we don't take account. Where we're just, bringing each other soup when we're sick, or millions and millions of things like this all the time. So it's already happening all the time. And there's something about that in there, right? Of trying to kind of lift that up a bit and value it. That is one thing we can do with imaginative work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes me think of how.
Sorry to quiz you like that.
Well, you said you spoke of metaphysical activism, and that makes me think about the dialectic of the book as it plays out in a very poignant way between the mother and the daughter, between Jane, the activist, and Maya, who's into mystics and really turns toward, as you say, a contemplative life. And one of the things I found very moving and honestly helpful is that the book addresses the quandary of, what sorts of actions to take, right? I mean, there's the disagreement between Jane and Maya about violence, and Maya says, you write that for her, violence can never be redemptive. She finds it hypocritical, and there's a deep disagreement there that I found reflective of the arguments that we see and the dilemmas, right, on the left, and what is to be done. But one of the things that was so moving was that I felt that Maya is a person who that it raises the idea that there are different kinds of work, and not all of them will be loud and attention getting, not all of them will be, these sort of acts on the street, or that there are different kinds of work and different needs, and that your book made a place for that. And I guess I don't know if I'm expressing this well, but in the sense that contemplation and working through and being a historian, right, and kind of sort of holding the history is not simply something bourgeois, or it's not simply left melancholy or melancholia. I don't know if that, if I wonder if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, maybe I'll say one thing about that, and then if you like, we can see if people have questions. So Maya's situation is that in order for her mother to do the work that she does, she is called to do, she abandons her daughter. So there is, again, the ambiguous or the ambivalent utopia, the work that she's doing in company with others paves the way for this great opening, this great turning, but it's not without loss or sacrifice. So that's the exploration there. And Maya's, in one way, it's now, I sort of describe this in the book, and I sort of think of her this way, like there's no idealizing that. Like she ends up having a life as a contemplative, but she sort of exists in the shape of loss. That is who she is, and that leads her to all kinds of interesting things, like she communicates with star people and different contemplative experiences that you can have when you spend a lot of time alone in the woods meditating and getting into a much bigger picture of things. But yeah, I guess just I felt important that, and maybe this goes back to the kind of this theme of didacticism, right? That there's that it's not idealized, that we're not idealizing what it can cost, what it can do. And I think that the sort of sense too, that this character who's a psychoanalyst, who's like working with these people who knowingly lied about climate change and so on, and is trying to talk to them about like, what was going on with you when you did that, is that there's all this work to do on consciousness as well, this kind of idea that we have to change material circumstances and then consciousness changes, but this kind of posits or plays with this idea that it's not one then the other, that they both happen at once, or they happen in different kinds of orders, or they're like the particle and the wave, or they're totally interconnected. You can't really separate them, I hope that's a part of some kind of answer to that. Yeah.
And the healing, I mean, you've described the book as an eco-poetics of healing, among other descriptions, but one of the things that's so great about it is that it doesn't give in to a fallacy, of healing as a cure, right? The remediation goes on, the repair goes on, We see that most vividly even towards the end of the book. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate that aspect as well.
Thank you, Eleni. I feel like I've learned a lot from you about that in particular in your work. So it's
Well,
very much part of why it can be in there is because of what I've learned from you.
it's we have a lot of kinship, I think, and
Yeah.
that's why we're having this conversation. Bringing it to you. Um,
Like, share that.
And please wait till I get to you. Usually it takes a few seconds for the. Okay.
Hi, I don't know if this is related enough, so you can tell me if you don't want to answer it. But like, my question is, in the act of creation, like finishing this book and then it being here now, do you feel like settled with it, or do you feel like, I don't know, what has been your process of like it's done and then it's here? Because I mean, obviously these conversations continue, but something about that.
Thank you for that question. I feel very unsettled with it. And it feels like it's still very open. And there's something maybe, thank you for asking that. There's something maybe about the form of it that makes it feel that way, the kind of collage of it. And the sort of way in which any book goes on to have a life of its own. And so there's something always just incomplete and unfinished, even as you find some kind of way of making it unified as an unfinished thing, because you have to stop at some point, I guess. Or it lent itself to stopping. It's that's one of those sort of craft questions, eternal questions of like, how do you know when it's done? And for me, it was like when I figured out the thing that I was having the most resistance to and having the hardest time with was the most important thing about the book, which was time, and organizing time and realizing the book is about time and it's about change over time. And once I realized that, then I could kind of make it into a frame narrative and it begins and ends in the same place. And then I could sort of start to like, with my wonderful editor, Lindsay Bolt's help, she said, why don't you make a timeline? And I was like, what? No, I can never do that. But then I did.
Anyone else? Going once? There we go. If you could pass. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I would love to hear more. Hello. I would love to hear more very didactic speech about what you see the use the phrase the metaphysical problem and then the metaphysical I guess not answer or solution, but activism or right action. Obviously through arts and imagination you gestured, and so I'd love to just hear more specifics about all of that because that sounds really interesting and intriguing, and important.
Really glad you asked. And I haven't seen you in a long time. And it is so nice to see your face. Because I brought this with me, because I was thinking it would be nice to talk a little bit about metaphysical activism. And so I brought this thing that my friend Preeta Lal sent me recently, or she told me about it. And it's like a resolutions for metaphysical activism. And the resolutions say, conventional activism has had undeniable value in progressively helping to mitigate or resolve said crises. Yet these crisis situations continue to worsen in nature and degree indicating the urgent need for a radically different approach. From the perspective of many Indigenous peoples and a growing number of awakening and awakened non-Indigenous populations, these predicaments are seen as largely symptomatic of a fundamental underlying crisis, i.e., a crisis of consciousness or of the spirit of a critical mass of humanity, which for the purpose of this resolution, we shall call a metaphysical crisis, both in terms of the cause and people's capacity to respond, to remediate the situation. Arguably, that metaphysical crisis is characterized by people's diminished connection with the planet and earthly relatives, including our responsibilities to coexist to the best of our capacity in harmony with them. And then finally, there's a kind of set of statements about the nature of reality, that it is fundamentally metaphysical, consciousness, energy, spirit-based, as opposed to malleable, molecular-based physical reality, and that there's an inherent power to generate from the metaphysical into the physical. So that, I feel like that really, it just resonates with what art can do to me. Yeah. Among other things, but also that kind of contemplative work and that kind of like not allowing ourselves to see the vida activa and the vida contemplativa as two, they're together. They need to be together. Yeah.
Got some questions online. Actually, Laura Mullen is in the room. She says, thank you for the glorious reading and thoughtful conversation. I was especially grateful for the pressure on imagination and the interest in making visible and celebrating forms of mutual aid, the variations on communism and socialism available here and now. Might the didactic be framed as a form of aid coming out of desire to give, and pain, quote unquote, keeps the relationship from becoming an uneven power dynamic, perhaps?
That's really good. Do you want to respond to that?
Let me pass this over.
Anybody want to respond to that? That's amazing. Okay.
They're not going to be able to hear him, so let me bring it back here. Would you hold on until we get to you?
Oh, no, that was the response.
I think they just wanted to say yes.
Saying yes.
Oh, all right. Anyone else? No. Okay, then Eleni, here.
Well, thank you, Laura Mullen, for that amazing remark. We'll take this home with us, that we can take up the didactic and we can stay close to the ordeal, the pain, and that's that kind of ability to get strength or strengthen ourselves to bear and process that, is part of, I love that it's keeping the didacticism from becoming asymmetrical or power over. It really begs the question of like what kind of relationships we're having with each other, and how are we listening to each other, and what kind of attention are we bringing to each other's trauma, and how are we helping each other to process what seems unprocessable. Yeah.
Oh, I was just thinking, Laura, that was so beautifully put, but that made me think about all of the pedagogy in the book and the education that Maya receives in the anarchistery, right? Which is, there are all these different kinds of cultivation going on there, and education is one of them. So, I mean, didactic gets a bad rap, has a negative valence, but what's the root of that? It's just simply teaching, and you teach, and your teaching is is a beautiful, deep part of this book. And and you and I were colleagues, once upon a time at Bard years ago. But that one of the things I liked about that was that the teaching. I think the conventional thing would be to say, oh, well, you risk being didactic if you bring in these thinkers and ideas and quotations. But that's the fabric of of cultivating consciousness, right? And learning how to think. And also what Jane passes on to Maya, and then Maya, makes her own. So anyway, I just wanted to put in a plug for all
Yes.
the great, revolutionary pedagogy in the book.
Thank you, Eleni. Yeah, just to add one thing to that, in The Storyteller, Walter Benjamin says, stories don't counsel us anymore, right? He laments this. It's 100 years ago or something, that now we're getting all our knowledge from data and information. But so then that feels like a provocation. Can stories still counsel us? Can they counsel us? Of course they can, No disrespect to Walter Benjamin, who I adore, and we all love. We love you.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour. Anyone else? No? Okay, let me pass that.
So when you talked about metaphysical crisis, you kind of launched into also talking about Frederick Jameson. Is there a way in which there is the failure of Western metaphysics actually contributes to generally a metaphysical crisis, in your opinion?
Undeniably, right? And it's so multi-layered. It's coming at us from so many directions. Yeah. So it's like the knocking is coming from inside the house kind of thing. What do you think? Yeah.
Well, on that note, Miranda, Eleni, thank you so much for gracing our halls. And thanks to all of you for joining us and those of you online as well.